For the rear brakes, we're going to use a standard set of replacement pads and rotors. Before we get started, we want to make sure we block off the front wheel opposite of the wheel that we're working on, and also the rear wheel opposite of the one that we're working on. And as another precaution, you want to put the car in gear or leave it in park. And remember, your emergency brake should be off when you're working on the rear brakes. Now we can go ahead and loosen up the lug nuts on the rear wheel and raise the rear of the vehicle. Once the back wheel is off of the ground, I'm going to put this safety pin in the jack and then install a jack stand underneath one of the jacking points as a safety precaution. After this, we can remove the wheel, and if you have a wheel spacer installed, make sure you remove that. Just like the front of the vehicle, I'm going to spray down the rear brakes before we get started. Now this caliper is held on by 2 bolts, one on the bottom and a second one up top. I'm going to use a small wrench combined with another one using the trick I showed you in the front brakes video to break each one loose. Here we are repeating for the bottom bolt. Once both bolts are removed, you can pull off the caliper. You won't be able to move the caliper too far away from the brake pads because the emergency brake cable is still connected, but that's okay. We'll use this coat wire hanger again to hang the caliper safely. Now once the caliper is out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the brake pads. Now, you have to be sure to keep the clips in case your new brake pads don't have them. Simply pry them off the old pads and set them in a safe place. Now we can go ahead and identify the caliper bracket mounting bolts here and here. And I recommend spraying them down before you loosen them. Again, we use a 2-wrench combination to break each one free. Here we are, just repeating for the bottom one. And with the bracket out of the way, we can remove the rotor. Now, we need to push the piston of the caliper back into the bore, but we can't use a C-clamp to force the piston back into the caliper. We need a tool like this with 2 tabs 180 degrees apart. Some people also like to use needle nose pliers, but a ratchet and this tool make the job a lot easier. Now in this case, we're turning it clockwise, which should be the case for most cars. If you're not sure, look for an imprint or an arrow marking on the piston itself. Now one thing to note is that the caliper piston indent needs to match up with the little tab on the brake pad here. If you line it up ahead of time, the caliper will slide onto the new pads. Here we're spraying down our new rotor with some brake cleaner to remove any dirt or oil from shipping, and then reinstalling. A lug nut on the bottom of the rotor will help keep things in place while we finish the installation. Now we can go ahead and reinstall the caliper bracket. At this point, we can go ahead and tighten them down before we do a final torquing. Now here we have the original brake pad clip, and you want to install it on the new pads. There'll be 4 total, and they'll help keep your brake pads from rattling inside the caliper assembly. again, we're basically putting the curly edge towards the outside of the pad on both ends. You might want to take note before you remove the clips from your original pads. Now here we have some disc brake quiet. We're going to spread some on the back surface of the pad. At this point we can position the new brake pad, and you might have to use a little force to get in a position. If you have to use too much force, then the clips are probably not installed properly. And now, once both brake pads are in, everything seems to be going pretty well, but we have a little problem here. As you can see, the bottom sliding pin is moving smoothly, whereas the top one is actually frozen. And this is a big problem because it doesn't let our brakes operate like they should. So I tried a number of things here, tried to use a clamp to break it free, even tried to chisel it out, and I was pretty frustrated at this point. So looks like we need a new caliper bracket, which luckily I was able to find that day. And you'll see here both pins slide freely, which will let the caliper move and compress on the rotors. The caliper bracket also comes with 2 bolts used to bolt the caliper to the bracket. So I've uninstalled the brake pads and reinstalled this new bracket, doing the final torque here. Again, check our notes section for the torque specifications. And once both brake pads are reinstalled, we're going to slide the caliper back into place. Now again, everything should fit together very smoothly with not too much effort. If you're having a little trouble, you might want to check that the piston indent is lined up with the brake pad tab, and as you can see here, the spring from the back of the brake pad needs to be underneath the caliper. And then you can go ahead and bolt it back together. Going through here and doing a final tightening. And when you're doing your brakes, make sure you take the pins out of the caliper bracket like you see here and throw a little bit of brake grease in there just to keep things moving nicely. Now we can go ahead and remove the lug nut, reinstall our tire, and lower the vehicle prior to doing a final torquing of the wheels. Usually, like I said, 85 to 105 foot-pounds. And before you hit the road, check our notes section to learn how to bleed the brake fluid, top off the brake fluid, and properly bed the brakes.